Well, we're very lucky today to have Dr. Dave Whitley as our speaker. Dr. Whitley is out here on the Fulbright Specialist Program, and he's hosted by the School of Geography, Archaeology, and Environmental Studies here at Wits University. So we're benefiting from his visit. Most of you will know Dave. For those of you who don't, Dave is based in California. Many years ago, between 87 and 89, he was out here on a postdoc, and he's come back again many years later. Dave has made an enormous contribution to rock art research, not the least of which was his editing of the Handbook of Rock Art Research.
The first Bible.
The first Bible. So we're very fortunate to have Dave, and thank you. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, David. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are and whatever time it is. It is, in fact, a pleasure to be here. Let me just say that. As David indicated, I was here 35 years ago for a couple of years. They were formative in my career. I've come back 35 years later, and what I've noticed, I'm here for like 2 or 3 weeks. They're getting as many lectures out of me as they can during that period. You know, they're trying to get 35 years worth of lectures crammed in. So this is, depending upon how you want to calculate it, it's like the 3rd or 4th or 5th talk I've given, and I've got a few more. Some of you, unfortunately, are probably going to see a few of them, and they're not entirely, sorry, but they're not entirely the same. They do follow a theme, and I just want you to know that, in fact, I will be talking about rock art in all of them, just in case you were worried on that particular point. I'm trying very hard not to repeat from one lecture to the next, although frankly, my primary concern is not using the same jokes from one lecture to the next. But let me jump into it because I got a lot to cover. 35 years worth of research in the next 2 or 3 hours. Is that how long we have? Something like that. What I want to do is address a fundamental issue in rock art research, which it's bedeviled the subdiscipline for many years, which concerns site distributions. And the subtext of that is the nature of ritual landscapes. Now, I recognize that this may not be as burning a problem, for example, for those of you that have the misfortune of having to work in the Drakensberg, for example, because I understand that there are rock paintings in every rock shelter, and there are rock shelters everywhere. But in other parts of the world, including probably the Karoo, I'd guess, rock art sites are unevenly distributed. And there's a reason for that, and it's useful to try and sort that out. So that's where I'm going today. That's the intellectual reason, but there's another one. There's a heritage management, a practical implication that, at least in my case, working in California, is quite significant. California is trying to go green. We're trying to go renewable energy by 2030 or 2035. One outcome of that is the Mojave Desert is being turned into a rural industrial landscape. Now, there is plenty being done towards protecting resources of all kinds, including heritage resources. But to address issues this big, basically large predictive models are being created. And while GIS predictive models may be pretty good for predicting where your campsites or lithic scatters are, they're not very well suited for rock art. So rock art is imperiled in that process, and adding to that first problem is a second problem, one that you may not be aware of, or I'm sure you're not. And this is the fact that major portions of the Mojave Desert are covered by US military training and research and development facilities. And those too are very destructive. And while the US Department of Defense, they actually spend more money on archaeology than has ever been spent before, in the realm of $200 to $300 million a year, because they've got to comply with environmental laws and archaeological protection, but they still need help figuring out where rock art sites are for planning in the future. Now, I have two areas circled here. The one at the top is the Coso Range, which is on the China Lake Naval Air Weapons Station. The one at the south end is at the 29 Palms Marine Base Combat Training Center. I'm going to talk about the Cosos because that's where my model comes from, my model of ritual landscape and use. But my study area for testing the model was down at 29 Palms, where we just completed a project that I'll be talking about. Now, let me just step back and say, in native California, in the far western North America, there has been a traditional view of ritual landscapes, partly tied to, well, completely tied to their ideas about the function of rock art, which is that it was created for signposting, to show where water is or to mark territorial boundaries. Now, if people read the ethnography, which they don't, but if they did, they know that actually the father of California anthropology, Alfred Kroeber, somebody who did more for our understanding of Native American peoples in the West, he said that was wrong over a century ago. Published 1925, but actually written in 1915. He said point blank, no, that's not what is going on here. And he was pointing to the fact that those kinds of interpretations can confuse correlation with causation. Rock art sites are sometimes located at water for reasons we'll get to, but it's not because they are quote unquote marking water. Now, what I've tried to do, this is going to be familiar to those of you here, is take a cognitive approach to a ritual landscape. And of course, this is an outgrowth of the ethnographic turn that really got underway here at WITS. And it focuses on the cognition, the mental models, the intellectual ideas that structure behavior rather than the behavior itself. Now, when we move in this cognitive approach to landscape, the key factor is that landscape is not a natural world out there. It's a cognitive construct. It's an idea about the empirical world, and it is based on metaphysical beliefs, specifically culture-specific ontology and epistemology. Now, here I'm talking about ontology. It gets talked about all the time in the current archaeological literature. It's the latest craze. It's completely confused. Ontology concerns the nature of existence. Somehow, folks have gotten this idea that ontology is about transactional relationships. They've been listening to Donald Trump and his theory of the world, and that seems to be where their view of ontology comes from. So let's step back and actually look at it in a little more sophisticated fashion. That said, here's the rationale. This is a statement by a friend of mine, an ethnographer who's working with contemporary informants doing fabulous work. And he points to the fact that quite simply and straightforward, Native American peoples have a conceptual idea of the world, what that world means in terms of their supernatural relationships and sacrality and all of those things. So that's really the rationale for what I'm trying to do here. Archaeological test, couple of components. First is the ethnographic data, and those come from two sources. One are the historical ethnographic records, the published things, which I've spent 40 years dealing with. I've combined those with current contemporary ethnographic studies, primarily being conducted by Rich Stoffel and his colleagues at the University of Arizona, and they fit perfectly. The contemporary information sometimes amplifies and fills in holes in the older material, but it all ties together very, very carefully, very, very closely. And among other things, it indicates that there is substantial traditional knowledge about religion still out there that we need to to keep in mind and incorporate into our research. Now, what I want to do is take the model that I developed out of the ethnography, and originally I applied it to the Coso Range to see if it fit there. I want to take that to a series of smaller sites in the southern Mojave Desert that are actually in the territory of another cultural group. The Coso sites up there, that area was occupied and used by Numic-speaking people, Paiute and Shoshone. The sites we're going to look at were created by the Serrano and the Cahuilla, who are Takik-speaking people. So we've got a different circumstance. We're looking at much smaller sites. The model seems to work for the Cosos. Is it going to work for your small site that's got a dozen motifs? Is kind of where I'm going. So just quick background. I think all of you know this. This is very similar on many levels to what we've got here with the song. Rock art created by shamans during vision quests. They're portraying their visionary imagery. You know what that is. You know where that's coming from. You know what it includes. Spirit helpers, usually animals, and also actions and events in the supernatural world, including especially transformations and sorcery. Rock art sites, well, the key here, I suppose, is supernatural power in the Numic languages, at least, is poha. Shaman is pohagunt, man having supernatural power. Rock art site is pohakani, house of supernatural power. Rock art sites, quite simply, were places where supernatural knowledge power existed, could be accessed, could be used, and for that reason, they were closely tied to shamans. Landscape. Landscape. How do we derive a landscape model out of this? Well, again, look at these metaphysical beliefs, ontological beliefs about landscape. They turn on the concept of supernatural power, poha. With respect to the world surrounding us, two key factors are important. Poha is differentially distributed both among people. Shamans have a lot more of it than everyone else. Everyone has some. Shamans have acquired more and know how to manipulate it. And it is also differentially distributed across the land. Some places are places of power. Those are where rock art sites are. The question then becomes, what are those kinds of places? What kinds of places have supernatural power? And I have pulled out of the ethnography my perception, my categorization of it. This wouldn't be a Native American categorization. This would be a Westerner's, but it just helps organize this information to make it a little more intelligible, hopefully for us. Hopefully this is intelligible. The first of the three phenomena, the three kinds of features that figure are geological and hydrological. And you can see them right here, and we'll run through them very quickly. Caves and rock shelters. Well, you know, rock art is universally associated with caves and rock shelters, whether that's taphonomic in some cases or not, or there are other things going on, I'm sure depends on the location. But in the Mojave Desert specifically, they were considered places of power and memory, and they were where supernatural power collected and could be found. And there are numerous of them in the Coso Range. I don't even have to include a picture there. Volcanoes and volcanic landscapes are a kind of feature that I did not expect. It's one that surprised me in Native American terms, which are absolutely correct empirically and literally. Volcanoes are where the earth is renewed and is reborn. Literally, new land is being created. And of course, this includes all kinds of volcanic landscapes, but the concept here is that supernatural power is in the earth and it comes up through landscapes, or excuse me, through volcanoes and spreads across the land, and thus is accessible by people. landscapes are, volcanoes very, very important. In volcanic landscapes, there are a variety of features, one of which involves talus or scree slopes. These are boulders that are on the side of the hill that are rolling down from time to time. These were believed to have, from the Native American view, they were rocks that moved. And because they were rocks that moved, they had agency and they were perceived as having the will to act. Therefore, they're supernaturally powerful places. And in fact, we find numerous talus slopes in the Coso Range that have rock art. Shamans were also buried in talus slopes because they were very powerful people, and their bodies, even when dead, were powerful, and you wanted to sort of put them away, someplace away from a village. And then in some cases where the talus is, the scree is small enough that this can effectively be done, people would hollow out low pits that they could sit in for their vision quest. Vision quest pits also occur on talus slopes. That brings us to hydrology. Of course, as I mentioned before, an early argument, you still hear it from people, rock art marks water. Well, you know, this is the desert. And I don't know about you, but if you spend any time in the desert, you don't need a rock art motif for sight to mark water. You can see it from a mile off because the differences in vegetative vigor. I mean, you can actually smell water in the desert if you've got any experience at all. So the actual causation is not rock art as a signpost. It's there because water is a supernaturally potent phenomenon, I guess, that has spirits in it. Spirits live in the water. So shamans would go to water sources and sleep to get spirit helpers, to get those spirits that lived in those particular locations. And if you look at the picture on the right, that's in the Coso Range. It's particularly significant in terms of understanding a ritual landscape. There is a lake in the Cosos. It's called Little Lake. That's it. It's not very big, but it's a lake. There's a cinder cone, a volcano there behind it. And if you look up towards top right on the basalt outcrop that is there, you will see a series of engravings that sort of pulls things together for the Cosos. But hydrology, hydrological features didn't just involve water sources. They also concern constricted drainages, confluences, and things like that. Features, hydrological, geomorphological features that might not originally have occurred to us. I mean, I didn't realize this until I saw it in the ethnography. And the concept here is that power is flowing like water from high mountain peaks. Why high mountain peaks? That's where it rains first. The mountains talk to the rain, bring the rain in, it goes down their sides, it flows, water flows, therefore power flows, and you get constricted places on drainages, and they accumulate power too. The final sort of physical phenomenon I want to mention involves vistas or expansive landscapes. Now, I've had some experience, well, I had Jim Kaiser and I had an experience where we were talking about, we were at a rock art site with a bunch of folks, tribal folks, talking about it, and I mentioned that, wow, this is a great panel. I could just see the person lying here. There was a big rock flat platform right in front of it. So that person was probably lying there for their vision quest and then created the motif right there. And one of the tribal members said to us, he said, "No, that's wrong." And Jim and I were both, our ears were perked up, and we said, "Really? What's, can you tell us about it?" And he said, "Sure." And he said, "No, you never look at the rock. You have to look off at the vista." And he pointed to Mount Hood, the biggest mountain in that region. This was in Oregon. Said, and the most sacred mountain. You have to look at the mountain during your vision quest. So the vista becomes very important. And in fact, Shamans needed it to call in their spirit helpers and to call in rain. So places that have a great vista are another potentially potent location. So that's the physical side. The more amorphous, harder to conceptualize archaeologically are locations that have fleeting events, geophysical and meteorological events. And these are basically celestial lights and earthquakes, transient aerial lights. We think of lightning, and that's the most common of them, but not the only ones, as we'll see. And these were considered to be sightings of supernatural spirits, and they also were thought to bring spirit helpers to shamans. Now, here's the interesting fact that I didn't know before I started looking into this, which is that the distribution of lightning strikes is geographically patterned. Theory, it can happen anywhere, but in practice, there are certain areas with much, much more than others. And there is actually very good data on this now available on the internet. I haven't had a chance to I need somebody to help me deal with the technical sides of pulling that data out and mapping it in GIS form. So I haven't sorted out how it plays yet with rock art, but I think it probably will. But the other one, earthquake zones, rift zones, absolutely is already well mapped. We know where they are, and they were very, very important. Earthquakes, again, caused by spirits. Shamans could predict and control them, they thought. And earthquakes have some interesting characteristics that you're probably not aware of beyond the kinetic energy that they release. Now, stepping back for a moment, that's a headline from CNN this week, which caught my eye. And it's, of course, talking about a volcano in Russia with a 7.00 magnitude earthquake, and the picture of it shows a bunch of lightning striking. And that, of course, is because volcanoes always, when erupting, have associated earthquakes. Magma is coming up from the center of the earth, and that's going to shake things on the ground. And volcanoes actually generate lightning, believe it or not. So it starts to become a synergistic series of effects. Earthquakes, similarly. Earthquakes result in very loud noises. I can attest to this because I accidentally woke up about 5 minutes before a major earthquake hit in Southern California, where I was living at the time, and I heard it coming. It was 5 a.m. in the morning. There was no other sound. I heard this sound. It sounded like a freight train. I had no idea what it was. Very loud, coming towards me. Bam, it hit the house. And then, of course, everything that could fall and break did fall and break. And then it was really loud, too. So earthquakes not only obviously shake the world, they're accompanied by massive sounds, and they yield earthquake lights. And I'm going to guess that none of you knew about earthquake lights before. Interesting phenomenon. They've been documented for 175 years, well established. What exactly causes them is not entirely certain, in the sense that there are competing theories, scientific theories about earthquake lights, and there's no consensus yet. But that they occur is certainly true. And here's what's cool. Now, you can go on YouTube and you can see videos of earthquake lights, which I think is pretty remarkable. Okay, so we've had geology and hydrology. We've had transient geophysical and meteorological events. And the third component of this model is cultural and behavioral. First, everything has life. Everything that's live has power in it. Where you have concentrations of life, you have concentrations of supernatural power. Where is that most common? In villages during aggregation phases of the seasonal round or the yearly round. Villages are also where water is located for obvious reasons in the desert. Those combined with the fact that villages became good places for vision questing and making rock art. And because people refuse to read the literature and realize that I've explained this 25 years ago, vision quests occurred during the summer, during the dispersal phase of the seasonal round. The reason for that is because when you go on a vision quest, one of the things you're going to do is you're going to climb a bunch of mountains, and you can't do that in the winter when they're covered with snow. And that, of course, is when no one is living at the villages. It's the dispersal phase. So there's no contradiction with a solitary or small group vision quest at a village that might be occupied by people in other times of the year. The other cultural or behavioral indicator are places that are previously marked. Just as graffiti begets graffiti, in a sense, rock art begets rock art. And the best explanation is this quote by Alex Carroll: "The logic was simple. If knowledge resides in powerful places, then let us return to those places where we can recapture it." And what this meant was people were looking for signs of previous use of particular locations for acquiring supernatural power. This included rock art, but was not limited to rock art, as we'll see. Rock art offerings, cairns, rock alignments, and prayer circles were all things that indicated that someone previously had obtained power at a particular location, promoting future use of it or additional use of it as well. So let's go to my test cases. 3 engraving locales in the southern Mojave Desert. Again, different kinds of sites than the Coso Range. These are small sites. You probably wouldn't write home about them. And they are actually in a different cultural area than the Coso Range up at the top. You can see the 3. I'm going to work from bottom right to top left here very quickly. The first one, the southernmost, it's known as the Foxtrot site. It's actually the largest site in the southern Mojave Desert. And of course, there's any number of ways to count things. So exactly how many panels you have, motifs you have, they're sort of meaningless, but maybe that gives you some idea of magnitude. It is about a kilometer and a half long. So it's a very big locality. And in fact, our job on this project, just to make this clear, we were hired to do 3D documentation, photogrammetric documentation for archival purposes. So we weren't really hired to do what I'm presenting here, but you've got to make the most of what you can. And I thought this would give you some idea of the rock art. This is probably aesthetically the best stuff that is at these sites. So those of you that work in the Drakensberg, don't look down your nose at this just because it's not as elaborate, as fancy, as beautiful. It's still very cool. And there are still important things we can learn from it. The second locale, up at the north central, smaller, very different kind of environment. You can see it's a bunch of boulders and cobbles, each of which has an individual or maybe 2 or 3 motifs, but separated by substantial space in between. And then the third locale up at the very northwest, this, depending upon how you want to categorize things, it has 3 sites or 5 sites or 6 sites. I think that those are clerical distinctions to me. But they're a series of small panels, let's just say that, on boulders located up at this area. How do these sites fall out in terms of the expectations of the model? Does it work? Can we take that model developed from the ethnography and applied to the Coso Range, and can we put it in the southern Mojave Desert for Tokic speaking as opposed to Numic speaking rock art and have predictive success? Foxtrot first, series of features associated with supernatural power. The first being and you probably guessed this already, a volcanic landscape. It's at the tail end, or at the termination of a large basalt flow. There's a seasonal wash that runs right in front of it. But I think what is most interesting about this place, and this is one of the surprises that came out of working there, is that it is seriously marked as supernaturally powerful, not by the rock engravings. And there's a great vista from the location where it is so marked. A marking, in this case, cleared circles on the desert pavement that sits above the basalt where the engravings are, and there's a vista from those. Now, these cleared circles are actually quite important and also a little mysterious. I mean, I looked at them and I immediately said, oh yeah, these are prayer circles or vision quest circles. And we had some tribal members working with us, some folks from the local tribes. And when I pointed them out to them, they said, oh yeah, absolutely. No question. Those are prayer circles. You'd come to a rock art site, you'd clear an area, sit down, meditate, hallucinate, and then make your rock art. Now, this was a big site. We had to go back 3 different times to get it all. And so, I had this discussion with those folks at the end of our first rotation. So I thought, yeah, absolutely. We've got to come back and we've got to record all these things the next time we come out, because they are absolutely part of this particular ritual setting, ritual landscape. I went home and I looked at on Google Earth, and I looked at where we were working, and this is just a component of it. And there are thousands, probably tens of thousands of these cleared circles here, which first told me, no, we're not going to map them all. We're not going to record them. We'll never get done. But second, I mean, this is far excessive of what I expected in proportion to the rock art. So I had to step back and think, what is really going on here? Get more into the cleared circle literature. And it turns out that cleared circles on desert pavements can be either cultural or natural in origin. And in this case, we're pretty sure that these are primarily natural in origin. They represent the scars created on the desert pavement by bushes that are now all extinct due to climate change. In other words, there was a kind of a low cover of probably creosote, Laurea tridentata, that covered this at one time. And due to climate change, it created many of these circles due to climate change. Those plants all went extinct, and humans then came through and assumed that this place had been used many times previously. They probably created some of their own, but the simple fact is here, there's no real distinction between what we would call natural and cultural. They were seeing it all as cultural. That's another predictor, another indicator of supernatural power. Locale 2, north central site or northeast site. You can see it's a very different environment. We also have a series of features here that are associated with supernatural power. The first being a volcanic landscape. There's again a dry wash that circles right around the site. It has also been marked as powerful, and here we get into some serious seismicity, earthquake activity. Air photo of the site location. You can see it in the bottom, towards the bottom right. And immediately adjacent to it is a volcano called the Pisgah Crater and a major lava flow called the Lava Lake Volcanic Field. And this immediately raised a question in my mind. Okay, volcanic landscapes are key places for rock art sites because they have power. Why is this rock art site not on the volcano or in the volcanic field proper immediately adjacent to it. What's going on here? Why is this not quite where I thought it would be? And the answer has to do with the nature of lava. Those of you who've been to Hawaii may already know this, or that those of you that took a course in volcanology may know this. But there are two primary kinds of lava. They have Hawaiian names because this was figured out in Hawaii, where there's volcanoes going off all the time. Pahoehoe, what you're seeing on the left, is smooth or ropey, whereas lava, bottom right, is very crumbly and sharp, and it's entirely unsuited for engraving of any kind. In fact, it's unsuited for walking across. I'd strongly recommend not even trying. For rock art, we have to have had lava that was pahoehoe turning into basalt that can actually be engraved. And what we've got at this location in the volcanic field immediately adjacent to the site is a huge expanse of lava or basalt. So the site is actually the closest location to these volcanic features that you could possibly create rock art. And that's where it is. It's on this coast slope of this ridge immediately adjacent to the volcanic field. The rocks themselves on the site are basalt, but they're basalt cobbles and boulders. And again, cleared circles here, but cleared circles of a different nature. They're bigger, and you can immediately see there's a creosote bush there. There's no way it's going to push these big lithic clasts out of the way. So maybe all of these are cultural. That was my first thought. And then I went home and looked at Google Earth. You can see where the site is. You can see it's on the toe slope of this ridge coming down. And you can see that there are cleared circles, not as dense by any means as what we saw at the Foxtrot site, but all over that landform. And of course, it keeps going. This is just a portion of it. What created these particular cleared circles? In this case, there are, in fact, a couple of natural processes that can create these. And I think many of them were created by the second process, which is ant nests. Ants create big nests. They soften up the ground. The cobbles on the surface sink down into the soil, leaving a cleared circle. I think many of these were natural, but of course, they were assumed to be cultural because Native Americans were not making that distinction. But I think that was a marking here that promoted the use of this location for vision questing and making rock art. Then we get to earthquakes. Now, California is a very seismically active state. The earthquake capital of the world, maybe, I think, or something. And everyone thinks in terms of the San Andreas Fault, which in the map on the left is the yellow dashed line that's going up towards the coast. It's the longest known earthquake fault in the world. I mean, it's major. But it's actually not where most of the seismic activity in California has been happening, at least in the recent past. It's occurring along what we call the Eastern California shear zone. And in fact, the geophysicists tell us that they believe that the San Andreas Fault is migrating eastward and will eventually be along this particular shear zone. Turns out that the Pisgah crater, right there next to this particular site, experienced one of the biggest earthquakes in the last 30 years, one of the three biggest earthquakes in the last 30 years in California, meaning that this location is seismically very, very active. It too has a series of characteristics that tied it to supernatural power. And that brings us to the last locale, the small site cluster, which frankly is, from the perspective of earthquakes and seismicity, it's in the same location. Effective location is the first. It too has a series of features that tie it to supernatural power. Earthquakes, but also water, and water in a different way, and then vistas. Let's look at the water first. And what's important here is all of these little sites are, in fact, on dry drainages that have water in them, but all of them are also on dikes, stone dikes that run across perpendicular across these drainages. Now, erosion has essentially cleared those portions of the dikes that are directly in the wash, but underground, there are still major components of those dikes, still rocks extending across that area, and those effectively serve as aquetards. Water moves down. A lot of folks don't realize most water is moving underground. Moves underground, it hits those dikes underground. That stops the water. The water pools there. It's maybe a foot or two below the ground surface, but all the animals know that, and certainly all the Native Americans do that, and all you have to do is dig a short distance into the ground, and there you're going to have pooled water. So the sites were at recognizable locations where water concentrated and thus supernatural power concentrated, and they were also at locations with very good vistas of the Pisgah crater. Now, that's in the center of the photos. That dark area, it doesn't look that tall. It was mined historically for cinders. We don't know how tall it originally was, but it certainly was taller and more prominent. So this being the third characteristic of this location, you'll note volcanic landscape is not one here. There still are variables, features that make sense in terms of the rock art. So where does this leave us? Well, all three locales do exhibit the characteristics that were predicted by the ethnographic model. The model then works for California and the Great Basin, regardless of the ethnic linguistic group, but I doubt that it works everywhere else. I'm not even suggesting that, although I think that the approach that I've taken to defining this model may be usable, and there may be some variables that overlap. The larger implications, though, I think concern the fact that hunters and gatherers traditionally have been viewed very much in a primitivist terms as people who just reacted to and adapted to the quote unquote natural world around them. They were like animals. They're only concerned with food, and that's the only way they're seeing the world. Is this a usable patch for collecting seeds or whatever? But when we turn that around and look at it from a cognitive perspective, we realize that instead, hunter-gatherers were creating and inhabiting a conceptual world that they themselves had brought together. Again, a much more mental, intellectual approach to life, which I think is missing in a lot of archaeological perspectives on hunter-gatherers. And of course, part of that is the fact that this world was filled with symbolic meaning that they lived in. But I have one final point I want to make, another implication, and this concerns heritage management. This is right around the corner from my house. It's not that far away. I had to drive through it to get to the airport to come here. I think we desperately need to and can develop predictive models of rock art site location that will improve our ability to preserve and protect these sites. And frankly, it's going to be hard. Some aspects of this particular model are already going to be easy to pull together, things like geological formations. Other things may be harder. So it's going to require substantial effort. But I think the future, if we can do it, will thank us for all that we've done in that regard. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you very much for your attention. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Dave. I think we can go straight into any questions. Are there any questions in the room?
Even more important, are there any answers?
Rose, if you could just give me a second. There we go. Do you want to come up and speak into the laptop, if you don't mind?
Speak into the laptop.
It's
a very easy question that you might have answered.
There we go. Do you want to, if you speak into the laptop? Then
So I was just wondering about those quest circles that you were showing, both the natural and the ritual ones. Do you know if they're like habitually returned to, if they're ritual ones? And is there cases of like natural ones that were then used in quests, or is it much more clear cut, the difference between them?
Okay, you're asking all these questions that I can't answer. For the simple reason that no one's really looked that carefully at them. And I frankly, there has been some debate in the literature about whether they're natural or cultural. The archaeologists saying they're cultural, the geologists, geomorphologists saying they're natural. Clearly, they're both. So both of that is going on. Whether people used other folks' prayer circles, I suspect they did, but I don't have any direct evidence in that regard. I mean, one of the characteristics of them is there are no associated artifacts. So it, you know, a bit of a mystery in that regard. What I will say is that I started looking around on Google Earth, and there are certain locations where I knew there were major rock art sites that I could also identify on Google Earth. And those that had desert pavements associated with them tended to have these cleared circle fields. Obviously not, desert pavement isn't everywhere, so it doesn't apply. But where there was desert pavement and a major rock art site, the circles were there. So.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Do we have any questions online? If you do have a question, please just raise your hand and we'll come around to you. Duduzi, do you want to come up, please?
Raise your hand.
Raise your hand.
Metaphorically speaking.
Yes.
I wanted to ask about some of the geometric images that you showed. It's a two-part question. One, is there difference, or what are the similarities and differences between the geometric images and the figurative images? The second part of the question is, have you looked at the meaning as yet of these images? And again, between the two sets of images, is there similarities and differences in that meanings?
Good question. And the first answer is, well, I've looked at them very closely. Is there a similarity between the figurative or iconic or representational and the geometrics? At a couple of levels, the answer there is yes. At the fundamental level, they're both coming out of visionary experiences. So the geometrics are essentially int optics, and the figurative images as well are visionary images. So certainly that. Now, the more complicated question is, do we have an understanding of the meaning of the geometrics? And the answer there is in fact yes as well, but at two very different levels. At the general level, we know that all of this rock art is related to visionary imagery and therefore concerns supernatural power. So we know these are images of power in that generic sense. I also have a small handful of these geometric images that I do have more detailed information on symbolic meaning. Zigzags, for example, very common. Those symbolized rattlesnakes. Why? Because sidewinder rattlesnakes make a zigzag in the sand. So they were using that as a model to communicate the fact that this is a snake. Similarly, diamond chains. Those are the scale pattern on the back of a diamondback rattlesnake. That was another conventionalized way of depicting a rattlesnake. So those two are very important. There's another one that I think actually is also quite important, which is concentric circles and spirals. Concentric circles and spirals, those were the whirlwind, the dust devil. They carried supernatural spirits they carried spirits, ghosts, and shamans into the supernatural. I can't, I'm having trouble remembering what slides I showed here versus the talk I'm giving tonight. But particularly in the Coso Range, we often have anthropomorphic figures, shamans, that are shown not with real faces, but with concentric circle or spiral faces. That's because they could use the whirlwind to go into the supernatural world. Now, whirlwind, let me just say a few more things about it because I think it's very cool. Whirlwinds go counterclockwise north of the equator because of the Coriolis effect. And if we look at the spirals, they are all going counterclockwise as well. When people did the circle dance, which was the primary both entertainment and ritual dance, these people, they always danced in a circle that went counterclockwise because, like the whirlwind, it concentrates supernatural power. And if you've ever seen a Hollywood movie about cowboys and Indians, invariably there's a scene where the Indians are sitting around in a teepee and they start passing a peace pipe. That peace pipe had tobacco in it. Tobacco, native tobacco, was actually the primary hallucinogen of the Western North America, believe it or not. It had 8 times the nicotine content of our strongest commercial tobacco. So it is, in fact, a potent hallucinogen. And 2 things with respect to passing the peace pipe. A, they were all getting stoned, but B, it was going around counterclockwise. So those are the only real geometric symbols or images that I've come up with any meaning for. Okay, other questions?
Other questions? Anyone online? No. Well, perhaps one final question from me, and that is, are some of these landscape features of any kind prevalent in myths and stories? And the other part of that is, are there landscape features that are depicted in some of the rock art? Thanks.
Okay, 2 questions. The first concerns the relationship of mythology and ritual, something that very few archaeologists think about because most of us, not all of us, but most of us were raised in some level of Judeo-Christianity, in that tradition where myth and ritual are entirely tied together. Our Judeo-Christian religions are efforts to recreate mythic events. If I'm including the Bible as in the terms of mythology, not to question anyone's belief, but just in a structural sense. Among these groups, there was no connection between myth and ritual, none, which is curious. And that's not true of all native Californians. We have an immediately adjacent group, the human-speaking people, the Mojave and the Quechan tribes, and their rituals were entirely I mean, they were like Judeo-Christian rituals in the sense that they recreated mythic events. So these guys, though, no connection, meaning these rock art sites are not intentionally located at places of mythic events, whereas with those Mojave and Quechan, absolutely point by point, they are at supposed places of mythic location. Now, the other thing you asked if there are depictions of landscape, not that I am aware of. That's it. Any other questions?
I think we can end it there. Thank you very much, Dr. Whitley. And for those of you in the room and online, Dr. Whitley is giving another talk this evening, so be sure to catch him there. And
it will also be on rock art. I promise it won't have any of the same jokes as today, but I can't say about the rest of it.
Thank you very much for the talk. And thanks to everyone for joining in the room and online.